Today's daf is daf Samach 60, and we are at 59b, Nun Tes Samach base at the Mishnah, about 8-10 lines from the bottom. To understand the conversation around this next section, we need to understand a couple of halachas in regards to korban, bringing an offering. The korban Pesach that's brought on the 14th of Nisan is brought as a specific korban for that specific day, for Pesach. So even though it is donated as a korban Pesach, and it is in the family, if we could call it, of shlamim, of peace offerings, it is a specific korban called a Pesach for that one day. If anybody brings it the rest of the year, meaning that they dedicated this lamb as a korban Pesach, but then end up bringing it any time in the rest of the year, either prior to when Pesach was, when it was supposed, they should have waited to the 14th of Nisan, they brought it earlier, or if they missed that time and bring it later, they would bring it as a shlamim, because that's what it essentially is. It's in that family of shlamim. But as in any korban, you have to intend for the action that you're doing. There are 4 parts of the service that are of essential to have the correct intent at that point. The correct intent would include what type of korban it is, whose korban it is, that it will be eaten in the proper time, in the proper place. So the first one over here, the Mishnah is going to tell us that if somebody brought the korban Pesach shalol lishma, without the correct intent, thinking that it is a different korban, not the Pesach. So they think, all right, this I'm bringing a korban as a chatas, a sin offering, as an ola, an ascent offering, even as a shalamim, even though that it's in the same family. But this is specifically a Pesach, and it would be considered the wrong intent by intending that I'm doing the service of a shalamim or any of the others at this point. This would be during the shchita, the shechting of the animal, the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the kabbalah, the bringing it to the mizbeach, the halacha, and actually spritzing it on the mizbeach, and that's the zrika, the spritzing or throwing the blood on the mizbeach. So these are the 4 parts of the service that need the correct intent. The Mishnah is going to tell us. If somebody had the wrong intent by any one of these actions, or by one action with the intent to do another action in the incorrect way. Meaning, during the shechita, they're thinking how they're going to do the spritzing of the blood on the mizbeach and what intent they're going to have there. So with this introduction, we're going to begin the Mishnah. Ha-Pesach, the korban Pesach, which is in the Shlamim family, but it is a Pesach specifically, sheshachta shaloi l'shmai, that he shechted it without the correct intent, meaning intending that it is something else, such as that it's a Shlamim, even though that it is technically in that family, but it is specifically Pesach, so that would be considered the wrong intent. Or v'kibel v'halach v'zarak, or any of the other 3 services, shaloi l'shmai, without the correct intent, or the intent as something else. Oy l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai. Or if he had the intent for the Pesach, but also for something else. And here the Gemara is going to explain, does this mean during shechting, during the one action that he did, slaughtering the animal, he intended that it's a Pesach, but also something else? Or what the Mishnah means is he shechted with the intent that it was a Pesach, and then he did the next step intending that it was something else. Or the reverse. He first had the wrong intent and then the correct intent. In any case, it's going to be puzzle. It's going to be invalid korban. So the Mishnah is now going to review as it was. Ketzad. So what's the case? L'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi, that he had the correct intent and then the incorrect intent. L'shem Pesach or l'shem shlamim. He intended that this is a Pesach and then intended that this is a shlamim. Shalom l'shmai v'lo shmai. And how was it that he first started off with the incorrect intent? L'shem shalomim. He first intended that this is a shalomim, and then l'shem Pesach, that it is a Pesach. So the Mishnah told us that if he had the wrong intent, instead of saying that this is a Pesach, he says that this is a shalomim. Even though I said the word said, it's unclear that he has to utter it. Although that's the opinion of Rashi and Zvachim, it's unclear that he has to utter it or at least think it. But we'll just use that term. So he says that this is shalomim when really it's a Pesach, and he does so during one of the services, or he does thinks both. He thinks that it is a Pesach, but also thinks it's a shlomim, or he says it's a shlomim and also says that it's a Pesach. And the Gemara now is going to ask: is this during one action he had both thoughts, or is it through in two different actions? The basis for the next discussion is something we saw a few daf back. A machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosef, whether somebody's first statement is what takes effect, or also their second statement takes effect. And this is in the case where somebody has a korban that he's dedicating in place of another korban, and he says this is harezu temuras ola and temuras shlamim. This is a replacement for an ola, an ascent offering. This is a replacement for a shlamim offering. By saying two statements, does one negate the other, and therefore the first one is what takes hold, and the second one cannot take effect anymore? That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. He said one thing that is already effective, and everything else that's said afterwards is just has no place to take effect because the first statement was effective. Or do we say that no, that both statements are valid, and even if they're contradictory, we're going to have to take them both into account, and in such a case, that animal is going to have to be sold off as both a ola and a shlamim, an ascent and a peace offering, and the funds will then have to be split to purchase a korban for each. So by Rav Papa. So Rav Papa asked, how do we understand our Mishnah? But avoda achas tana, in our Mishnah, when it says that he had two intents, first as a Pesach, then as a shlamim, or vice versa, is that in one action, in one part of the service, or in two parts of the service, such as did the first way would be that he had the intent of it being a Pesach, and in the same action he changed and utters or intends that it's a shlamim, or do we say no? It's not during one action, but during two actions. He shechted with the intent that it's a shlamim, that it's a Pesach, and then as he's bringing the blood to the mizbeach, or as he's spritzing the blood on the mizbeach, intends that it is a shlamim. So he switches the intent from action to action, from part of the service to part of the service. So now the Gemara explains its own question. Ba'avoda achas tanan, is our Mishnah talking about one action, and therefore Rabbi Yossi, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who we saw earlier, the Amar af b'gemar devarav adam nitvas, that a person's statements both will take effect. Not only the first one, which came on a blank slate, and so it took effect, but even the second statement, which came upon a contradictory first statement, nevertheless, the second statement will also take effect. And so in our Mishnah also, even though he already said, I'm shechting this animal for the sake of the korban Pesach, nevertheless, when he then also says or intends that this is a shlamim, in the same action, it'll negate it because both can take effect. However, the Rabbi Meir, this has to be Rabbi Yossi, because if it's Rabbi Meir, he already said that we only take the first statement into account, and that's all that's going to take effect here. So then the first intent that this is a Pesach would be valid. The second intent that he says, oh, this should be a shlamim, is no longer takes effect because this act, this shchita, has already been defined by the first statement, according to Rabbi Meir. Or perhaps, in reality, this is our Mishnah is talking about two separate acts, and in one act we're not going according to Rabbi Yossi specifically. It could be Rabbi Meir as well, and therefore he would hold that would be valid because only the first statement is what counts. So our Mishnah would only be talking about two acts. Va'afilu Rabbi Meir, and then it will work even according to Rabbi Meir that the first statement would take effect. That's to define one act, one part of the service. Aval b'shtei avodas, but in two separate avodas, two parts of the service. Moida de mifsel. Then he would agree that it would take effect, and indeed, if during the Shrita he intended that it was a Pesach, but then later, while spritzing the blood on the Mizbeach, he says this is a Shlamim, then indeed it would count as a invalid Korban on account of having the wrong intent at the later action, at the later part of the service. Amri Ahai. So the Gemara says on which part of the Mishnah are we talking about? Are we talking about where he first intended that it was an invalid Korban? It doesn't make a difference what he intended after. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi are going to agree it's invalid, because after all, on the clean slate, on the initial intent was that it was the wrong intent, that it's a shlamim, which makes it invalid. So who cares how he changed it back? Everybody agrees that the first intent, the first statement is going to be a valid statement, and already from the start would invalidate this. So regardless of whether it's in one act or two acts, it's Bein Rabbi Meir, Bein Rabbi Yossi. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi would agree if Saleh Mekamaisa, the first act from the first moment, it'll become invalidated because he intended this as the wrong Korban from the start. The whole Rabbi Yossi Nami, because even Rabbi Yossi who said that we're going to take both statements into account, he says that also the second statement will take effect, but the first for sure will take effect. That's what he's going to hold. So everybody would agree that last part of the Mishnah, where he intended from the start that it's wrong, the wrong Korban, and then later changed back to the right thing, and the right intent, it's not going to change it. It's already been invalidated by the first moment. So our question of in understanding our Mishnah, whether it's in one act or multiple acts, is it in the one service or in the multiple services? That's the question. Where he had already stated that it was a valid Pesach, he intended the right thing, and then changed with the intent to the wrong. Would we say that it invalidates even in one act, or does that wrong intent have to be in a second part of the Avodah? Tashema. So come in here. Our Mishnah said, "Ha-Pesach sheshachta shaloi l'shmoi." The Korban Pesach, which he shechted with the wrong intent, the intent of it being something else, a shalamim, or v'kibel, or he received the blood that way, v'halach, or he brought the blood to the mizbeach that way, v'zorak, or he spritzed the blood that way, shaloi l'shmoi, with the intent that it's something wrong, something that it is not. It's a shlamim. So hechidami, what's the case of our Mishnah? Inema kediktani, is it as simply as it reads? Why does he have to have the intent by each one of these steps right away? When they had the intent from the beginning, it would count that way. So the simple reading of the Mishnah would have read that he intended during all four of the steps. So obviously that's not what it means, because as soon as he intended an invalid thought at the Shechita, it's already invalidated. So rather, what does it really mean? He shechted it with the wrong intent. Inami, or not and, but or sheshachta l'shmoi. He shechted it with the correct intent by the shechita, right? As he moved on to the next step, v'kibel v'halach v'zarak, and did one of the next steps shaloi l'shmoi with the wrong intent. Inami, or or even did the first three steps with the correct intent. But the last step, the spritzing of the blood in the mizbeach, was done with the incorrect intent. Now, that's the obvious way of reading, we have to read the first part of the Mishnah that way, which tells us already in the first line of the Mishnah that he intended the wrong intent when he shechted it, or he intended the right intent, that it's a Pesach at the first moment. And then as he moved along, he had the wrong intent, which is by b'shtei avodas. That means that in two separate parts of the korban, he had first the correct intent and then the incorrect intent. The havale shtei avodas. So now let's go to the next step of the Mishnah. L'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi, where it says he had the correct intent and then subsequently the wrong intent. Heichidami. What's the scenario of the second part of the Mishnah? If you tell me that he first shechted it with the correct intent, and then at one of the subsequent steps, at a next part of the avodah is where he had the wrong intent, that's already the first part of the Mishnah. The next part of the Mishnah can't mean that, because the first part of the Mishnah we said to make the first part of the Mishnah make sense, we have to explain that the first part of the Mishnah means that he shechted. He did the first step with the correct intent, and one of the next steps with the incorrect intent, and then it's going to be invalid. So when it later says in the Mishnah that he did it l'shmoi v'shelo l'shmoi, both he intended the correct intent and the wrong intent, that has to be within the same service. So it must be, it's within one act he intended for it to be correct and incorrect. Rabbi Yossi, and therefore must be the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who says that the first statement is not going to be the final statement, which is Rabbi Meir's opinion, that once you said one thing, that's what takes effect and defines the action. Rabbi Yossi says no. Even the second statement of a person is going to define their action. And therefore, even though that at the beginning of Shechita, he intended for the correct intent, but if within that same act, he changed and stated that this is something else, it's going to both will take effect and it will invalidate at that point. So the Mishnah, the Gemara is trying to prove it from the Mishnah itself. It proved by logic that the first line of the Mishnah has to be talking about where he intended during step one that it is a Pesach, and then during step 2, 3, or 4, he intended that it is a shlamim, and that it invalidates at that later step. So the next part of the Mishnah, which says that it is both that he intended that it is both a Pesach and a shlamim, correct and incorrect, but that must be talking about within one act itself. So Gemara says, "Lo elo mishtei avodas, v'reisha dekoi b'shchita machshav b'shchita, einami dekoi b'zrika kamachshav b'zrika, sefer dekoi b'shchita v'kachashav b'zrika." So here the Gemara is introducing a midway between the two. We, in defining our Mishnah, we're asking, is our Mishnah, when it says that he intended for correct and then incorrect thought, that it is a Pesach and then he thought it's a shlamim, was that in two separate acts? And we proved the first part of the Mishnah has to be talking about that. Or is it in one act and wanted to prove from the fact that the first part's talking about in two acts, that the first is talking about one act? However, now the Gemara is going to make a distinction within one act itself. When I'm doing the service, I can be thinking about the part I'm doing now. So that is the shechita that I'm doing now. I'm shechting for a korban pesach. Step one, as I do it, I'm doing it for the intent of this particular korban. There is, however, another step possible, which is in between. During the act of step one, I'm already thinking about what I'm going to be doing step 2, 3, and 4 for, what intent I'm going to have. So not while the first part of the Mishnah talk about while I'm doing step 2, I have the wrong intent. However, it's the alternative to bevas achas in one act is not that I'm thinking about the act I'm doing now, the shechita, or whichever step I'm up to. I'm thinking during step 1 that I'm doing step 1 for Pesach. And when I do step 4, I'm going to do it as a shalamim. So during the same act, I have two intents, but not contradictory about this one act, but rather during act 1, I'm thinking about Act 4. And I intend to do Act 4 with the wrong intent. So Gemara says, La'olam, in reality, I could tell you b'shtei avodas. It's talking about that his intent is in two separate acts. The first part of the Mishnah is talking about that he's intending about the act that he's doing now while doing that act. So whether it's shechting, he's intending for shechting, or when he's, one second, Michael, or when he's spritzing, he's intending for spritzing. However, the later part of the Mishnah, the second part of the Mishnah is intending like this. He's intending that he's doing the act of shchita for the intent of it being a Korban Pesach. And while he's doing the shchita, while he's doing step 1, he's intending that he's going to do step 4 as a shlamim. The Amar Hareini Shechet as a Pesach l'shmai. I am shechting the Korban Pesach with its intent. In order to spritz its blood, which is a step 4, with the intent that it's a shlamim. And this would teach us that your intent during one step negatively about any of the other steps is going to count as an invalidating thought. Yes, Michael.
So I'm not sure what we did with the original premise that we discussed also yesterday, but that whether we're toifes on the first lashon or the second lashon, I mean that kind of is germane here, but it's kind of like not part of the thing. But by machshava, you can't have two machshavas at the same time. You know, even if you're doing the avoida, so you had that machshava, and then you had that machshava. I mean, it's not like they were true during the same avoida. You had two different machshavas, but you didn't have the machshavas at the same time.
So
it's impossible to have two machshavas at the same time.
So first of all, I have to say that I think that it is easier to have two separate intents, contradictory intents at the same time, than it is to have the two statements, contradictory statements at the same time, because you can only utter one word at a time. So it's only possible to say one and then afterwards say another, and that's a part of Rabbi Yossi's argument why we're going to take both statements into account, because you simply can't utter them both at once. I think it's easier to have an intent about both more than a statement about both. You can have a thought that says both. As I mentioned earlier briefly, Rashi is of the opinion that anytime we talk about the shalol l'shmai, it's the thoughts about a korban, we're talking about an actual statement. That's in Gemara in the Gemara Zvachim. That's not necessary for our conversation in any case, because whether it's an intent or a statement, you can have subsequent, but immediately subsequent intents, and that's what Rabbi Yossi says will have to be taken into account. When somebody says, I'm doing this as a shlamim, as a Pesach, or as a Pesach, as a shlamim, both those statements are going to be taken into account because they are, according to Rabbi Yossi, because they are subsequent or one immediately after the other. And even though that one was said first, the other is also going to take effect. And the same is with intent. If while doing act A, I intend I'm doing it for reason A, and then I'm doing the same act for reason B, during the same act I'm switching or adding to my intent, that will, according to Rabbi Yossi, invalidate. And really the first line in the Mishnah is talking about two acts. What we're trying to figure out in the second line in the Mishnah, is it within the same act? How do we define it? Do we define it in the same act about the same act, or within the same act about another act? That's where the change is. So he says, and this was this last explanation the Gemara said, that while doing step A, he says, I'm doing step A for Pesach. And step B that I'm going to do is going to be for shlamim, for the wrong intent. Did that answer that, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
I'm getting the sense that it didn't. Well, what's the question?
Listen, I didn't get it in Zvachim. I didn't get it last time. Okay, I'll keep listening. I mean, it's complicated stuff. It's very difficult. It's very difficult conceptually.
It is. But the idea is that the intent during part A is valid because it's about itself. But during part A, I'm already thinking what I'm going to be doing part B for, and I have the wrong intent for that.
It just feels like we're in three different sugyas. It feels that there's like a lot of moving parts here.
Absolutely. Trying to set it up so that we can successfully understand it. So by Rav Papa. So Rav Papa now is going to ask a question to try and prove this outstanding question. Is it talking about in the second part of the Mishnah where it says that he had the correct intent and then the incorrect intent? Is that within and about the same action, that he intended this action correctly and during that action intends that same action incorrectly? Or are we talking about that action he exclusively is doing correctly, but during the same action he's intending to do another step incorrectly? Tashema. Well, let's look at the reverse. The reverse is where he starts off with the incorrect intent and then says that I'm doing it for a Korban Pesach, the correct intent. Puzzle, it's going to be invalid. Hechidami. Now, what would the explanation of that be? If it's in two separate actions, that he shechted the animal exclusively with the intent that it's the wrong action and the wrong carbon. And then subsequently, and he's intending that one of the next steps I'll do for the correct intent. Well, we already said in the first step of the Mishnah that if you do another step invalid, it's going to be invalid. So why would this become valid now? If the initial intent is wrong, must be that it's within one step that he's switching and he's going and in this first he had the wrong intent and then quickly corrected himself within the same action. That means he begins shechting and says, I shecht this for the sake of a shalamit, and then says, no, I shecht this for the sake of a Pesach. So he changed within the same act. Nevertheless, it's going to be invalid. And with the Sefer Bavadachas. So once we say that the last part of the Mishnah must be talking about that it's all about the same act, because otherwise, for sure, it's invalid. He already did one complete act with the wrong intent. So Reishanami Bavadachas. So then I have to say that the first part of the Mishnah is also talking about that it's all in one act. No, really, it's all talking about two acts. And you're right. There's no need to tell me that if he starts off with the wrong intent, that it's going to be invalid, even if he switched to the correct intent, because he had the wrong intent. Of course, you're right. That is obvious from the first two steps of the Mishnah. The third step of the Mishnah is totally unnecessary. And you're right, it didn't need it in the Mishnah. But once we said he started off with the correct intent and then changed to the incorrect intent, we said the inverse. He started off with the incorrect intent and went to the correct intent, even though that's obviously invalid because he started off with the wrong intent. Tashema. So we're going to try and prove this from another halacha. The Korban Pesach. Yes, John. That's the Kohen insurance. That if the Kohen invalidates with his intent, invalidates the Korban, that we then now have a new Korban that needs to be brought. We learned about that back in Zvachim last time around. The next brisa, the next is really a Mishnah later, and the next Mishnah is going to be talking about various other aspects of intent that's needed by a Korban Pesach. The Torah says that the Korban Pesach each person according to how much they can eat, you will slaughter the korban, meaning that the korban Pesach requires a certain amount of needs participants who are then going to be able to eat the korban, and these participants have to be designated to the korban. These are called menuyim, designated people for this group, a chabura. A group of people are going to have their seder together, and they are designated to the same lamb, and they have to remain designated to that lamb, and that's where they're going to eat. And each one has to be able to eat a kazayas, at least an olive size, of the korban. Now, what happens if somebody brings a korban Pesach, but nobody can eat? They're all old, young, frail, tameh. They're not allowed to eat it because they become spiritually impure. They are uncircumcised and arel. These would be invalid and would invalidate the korban. So shachta shaloi la'echlav. He shechted the korban Pesach to people that cannot eat the korban Pesach. They don't have the physical ability to eat. Or people that have not been designated to this korban, either not designated or they're designated elsewhere. They're not part of this group. La'arelim, people who are uncircumcised. L'tameim, people that are tamei. Puzzle, so the korban is going to be invalid on account of that this was designated for the wrong people. There clearly, the intent is in one action, in one part of the service. And there it's in one act. And since the next Mishnah or a later Mishnah is talking about that it's in one act, there was the wrong intent. So to over here, it's talking about a one act. So Gemara says, meet the area. What gives? So each scenario could be talking about its own scenario. There it's talking about where the intent was during one act, and here it's during multiple acts. That's not proof. The end could be talking about the next Mishnah or a later Mishnah could be talking about where he intended by one act the wrong intent, and here it could be talking about maybe one act, maybe two acts. It's not going to push it one way or another. Tashema. We're going to try and prove it from the next part of that Mishnah. Somebody included in their group adults who can eat, as well as children who cannot eat any of the meat. So it's going to be kosher in that case. Hey Chidami, what's the case? Is it that he did service A, the number one part of the avodah he did with the intent for people that can eat? And then the next step he did all exclusively with the intent for people that cannot eat. And then why would it be kosher? Because at a later step, there is no intent about eating it. The intent can only be about the service. During the shechita, the intent of how to eat it and who's eating it would invalidate it. But during the spritzing of the blood, an intent of who's going to eat it is not going to invalidate it because there's no machshevas eichlin, an intent of eating it during the later parts of the service, which is spritzing the blood. Which would tell us then that if during the shechita, during the time that he shechted the animal, he intended the wrong intent, where the intent about who's eating it is a valid thought during shechting. Shechting is necessary for eating it. So puzzle. So that would indeed invalidate it. Wait, but when some of the people can eat it, that's sufficient. I don't need everybody in the group that can eat it. As long as some of the people can eat it, that's a valid intent. So the Gemara now is telling us that the reason why it's going to be valid in that case is because if you have intent for 20 people, 10 of which can eat and 10 cannot, so that's going to be a valid intent for a korban because you have people that can eat it. So now we go to Samach Hamid Beis, Elolav Bavadachas. So that later Mishnah must be talking about that even in one action, he intended that it's for people that can eat it, and for people. Then he intended that for people that cannot eat it. And with the sefer b'avodachas or shenam b'avodachas, therefore we're going to say that if the later Mishnah is talking about that the double intent, first for people that can eat it, and then for people that cannot eat it, it's going to be valid. It's within one action, within shchita. So to over here, within one action, he intended for the correct intent that it's a carbon pesach, and then changed and thought that it was a shalamim, and that will be a sufficient invalidation in our Mishnah. So Gemara says again, midi area, is that really a good proof? Each Mishnah is talking about its own scenario. Seifa b'avodah achas. The end of the Mishnah, a later part, is talking about where it's all in one service. And over here, we still have to figure out, it can be in one, it can be in multiple services, and that's what our question still stands. Was it all about the shechita, or during shechita you had intent about something else? And this would not prove it. Ibaylu. So we're going to ask a question. Pesach sheshachta b'shari masashana l'shmoy v'shaloi l'shmoy. Now, and this is it takes a little more focus because it's a little bit complicated. We mentioned at the introduction, a carbon pesach is really in the family of shalamim. Shalamim are peace offerings. They can be brought any day of the year. A person can offer it, and then they have to eat it with other people, with friends, and it's going to be a shalamim offering. A pesach is a specific type of shalamim that only comes on the 14th day of Nisan, the day before Pesach. So if I designate a carbon, an animal, as a Pesach, and I bring it as a shlamim any other day of the year, that it is a shlamim. So it's designated as a Pesach, but if I bring it on Purim, then it's going to be a shlamim, and I must intend for a shlamim. And essentially, I'm intending for the wrong thing, meaning wrong based on my designation, but it's correct on this very day. So that's a unique type of carbon. Every other carbon on any given day, the correct intent is what I designated it as. And the wrong intent is anything else. A Pesach, I designate it as Pesach, so the wrong intent is actually valid all year round. And the correct intent, meaning if I bring it as a Pesach on Purim or on Hanukkah, it's not going to be valid because there is no such thing as a Pesach on Purim or on Hanukkah. So the correct intent is actually incorrect, and the incorrect intent is correct. Or more precisely, the intent about what itself is incorrect, and the intent about something else, intending for this to be something else, is correct because it can't be itself today. So the Gemara asks, if somebody shechted during the year, any other time in the year, a carbon Pesach, lishmoy, as a Pesach, which is invalid, because it can't be a Pesach on Hanukkah. V'shaloi lishmoy, but also then intended and said, well, actually, it's a shlamim, and which is not as its designation, but is correct on that day. Mahu, miasi shaloi lishmoy, mapik le'midei lishmoy. Does the change to the correct way to bring it, which is against its own designation, does that extract it from its designation and bring it to a correct action, and would make it valid, or not? So kiyasar Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi, who we said would, sorry, John, what was that? So it's not purely intent. Correct. For Korban Pesach, that's true. It has to be the correct intent based on the correct situation. A Korban Pesach on the 14th day of Nisan is a Korban Pesach. A Korban Pesach all year round cannot be a Korban Pesach because it's not the 14th of Nisan. So it actually it would be invalid with its own designation. It therefore must be brought with a new designation, something contrary to its original designation. It has to be brought as shaloi l'shmoi, not for its designation, but for a shalamim, because that's the only thing it can be on any given day of the year.
So do we have any other situations like that up until
No,
now?
this is the only. No,
This
this
is
is the
only
only carbon that can be untrue to itself, and that's the way for it to be valid. It's non-Pesach. Oh, so then it's good. If you bring the Pesach untrue to itself, you bring it as a shalamim on Hanukkah, then it's valid. You bring it true to itself, you bring a Pesach as a Pesach on Hanukkah, it's invalid because you can't bring a Pesach on Hanukkah. You can only bring it one day a year, and actually one afternoon of the year, right? It has to be Bein Arbayim.
The flip side is, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so the flip side is that Pesach and Chatas, if it's not the right name, if you don't call it the right name, it's not going to be valid at all.
Right. That's the first. That's our Mishnah that we started with today.
Right.
Where you brought the carbon Pesach, even though it's within the family of Shalomim, but you brought the correct carbon on the correct afternoon, the Pesach on the 14th in the afternoon, and you called it and you designated, not designated, it's designated as a Pesach, but you intended for it to be a Shalomim, that invalidates it. So it has to be a Pesach on the 14th in the afternoon as a Pesach for it to be valid. Here we're asking if you flipped it on its head and brought it during the year and it cannot be true to itself. You cannot bring it as a Pesach on Hanukkah because there is no such thing. So you have to bring it as a Shalomim. And you started off bringing it as a Pesach, and you said, this is designated as a Pesach, and I'm shechting it for the sake of Pesach. And then you say, no, I can't do that. So I'm designating and shechting it, not designating. You can't change the designation. I'm intending for this to be a Shalomim. That would remain invalid, or does that new intent extract it from the original intent that you had? You first intended as a Pesach, which is what it was designated as, but that would be invalid because it can't be a Pesach today. So then when you switched into Shalomim, the Gemara's question is, does that extract it? Can that undo the initial thought or not? We're going to have to leave this for tomorrow, where Rav Dimi, who traveled from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael and back in order to teach the teachings from one academy to the other, is going to tell us a discussion about this, and hopefully then be able to define our Mishnah of whether it's in the intent is in two acts or in one act alone.